Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. Um, I'm Dr. Melanie Ochalski, a reproductive endocrinologist and certified menopause practitioner, and I am thrilled to be joined tonight by Dr. Mitchell Crawford, who is a psychiatrist at WellSpan Philhaven and has a very unique specialty in addiction disorders. And tonight we are here to talk about alcohol and when it can become dangerous and lead to unhealthy behaviors, particularly in women. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Crawford.
Oh, absolutely. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So as I was thinking about tonight's webinar, I realized that there are perhaps several participants who are listening while enjoying a glass of wine. And we hear a lot about the potential health benefits, possibly, of some alcohol beverages like wine. So my first question is there any amount or frequency of alcohol intake that is okay?
Yeah, so fantastic question. Asked by many friends and family members as well. What is the data showing us? Because I think about alcohol a little bit, it's like coffee. There'll be a study that comes out and says, hey, that morning latte is good for you. And then the next month it's like, no, don't do that. It shortens your life by 5 years or something. And it just goes back and forth. And so there is certainly a lot of confusion. So it's a really good question. Some folks are a little disappointed by this answer I give, in that for the vast majority of us, however old we are, whatever gender we identify with or anything, there's no amount of alcohol that is beneficial, that is in regards to health benefits. Now, you can make some arguments on that to say, well, I find it to be an engaging social activity. We do it in safe ways. We don't have any adverse effects of this. We understand that it's not necessarily going to have health benefits, but it's an activity that I enjoy. And we could certainly talk about the differences there. And then there's this space that is even a little more complicated of like, okay, so I drink alcohol. I understand that it's not necessarily going to be like, eating Brussels sprouts or, taking my vitamin. It's not going to give me health benefits, but like, how bad is it for me? And when is it a problem? And so I think we'll probably explore some of that stuff together. And we can talk a little bit more about those studies. One of the studies I'm citing was a large analysis, meaning it was a study of studies, essentially. It was, let's look at all those things I was telling you about where they're saying it's good, it's bad, let's combine it all and see what the results are. And there was this one little sliver of population that unfortunately for the talk of tonight was only in a subset of men that had any remote benefit from a medical perspective of drinking alcohol. And so folks are often disappointed by that answer because they see like, oh, but red wine, and they hear about resveratrol and it's an anti-aging molecule. And sure, it may have some very unique properties, but the fact remains that the studies show us there's no like elixir of life in alcohol.
Yeah. As I was preparing for tonight, that was the sobering, no pun intended, truth that I came to realize, that the health benefits of substances like resveratrol that are in red wine, you would need to consume massive amounts for it to have a clinical benefit. So, okay, so is there a safe dose? So if there's not definite health benefits, is there a point where it's too much and unhealthy? And so is there such thing as a safe dose? And is it different for men and women?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I have to be a little bit careful with saying safe, because the studies that we have looking at, what we consider to be quote unquote normal behaviors of consuming alcohol and when does it become problematic. And you'll see terms when you're looking this up of like high risk or dangerous behaviors, et cetera. those are not actually like set in stone. This is again like studies where we're looking at thousands, tens of thousands of people, and we're looking at large data sets, and we say, okay, when you average this out across this gender and age, this is what tends to be like a threshold of when we start to see more complications, or there's more kind of dangerous behavior or problematic behavior associated with it. So that's the caveat, because I can tell you anecdotally, as someone who specializes in addiction medicine, I've seen folks that would drink a gallon of vodka a day for decades and have less medical complications than someone who drank a six-pack every night of beer for 5 years. And so there really is a vast difference in the way that our bodies react and how kind of harmful alcohol can be to us. Now, I'll get off my soapbox a little bit here and answer your question more directly. I feel like a politician a little bit. No offense to any politicians who may be listening or watching this recording. We value what you do. But to answer the question more directly, there are guidelines put out. One is by an organization called the NIAAA, which is a large kind of national organization, and they talk about safe-ish limits, that threshold of when you kind of cut over into high-risk drinking, being 7 drinks total per week for a woman, and no more than 3 drinks at one occasion. Now, if you really dig deep into this, they're talking about a 2-hour timeline. So if you have more than 3 drinks as a woman during a 2-hour time period, then that is considered risky drinking. And then 7 total. So if you have a drink every night or such, and that's different. I'll contrast that to what they look at for men, and men have greater than 4 drinks in a 2-hour period, and they can have a total of 14 drinks of alcohol in a week. So it's a really big difference. I don't know if we'd be interested in exploring why that happens. I don't want to bore folks. I could talk for hours about this topic. So,
yeah, well, is it, and I don't want to belabor the point either, but I would imagine that body weight must come into it, or maybe not.
Yeah. So body weight, body composition is a huge factor there. As we know, women tend to have larger percentages of body fat just by design than men do. And the way that our bodies actually are able to metabolize the alcohol or break it down is different in men and women. And the way that affects us is different as well. And so we see more earlier and more severe cases of like alcohol-related brain damage in women than men. We see increases in things like breast cancer. Of course, we know alcohol is associated with lots of problematic diseases like liver cancer itself, but then liver failure and cardiac disease. We tend not to think as much about those associations, but there's certainly the capability of developing those at a higher rate.
Yeah. It's reminding me of, I once heard this little saying that if you put alcohol in your dog's drink dish, they would never touch that. They just intuitively know there's nothing good for them in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm not familiar with that. I do know, like, interestingly, they studied some monkey populations, like chimpanzees and such. And what they found, and this is off topic, I apologize for the tangent, but that they actually developed similar rates as the human population of the monkeys who would develop problematic drinking, and the monkeys who would not walk away from that bowl.
Oh,
And
wow.
would become actually, at least physiologically dependent, for all case and purposes, probably addicted too, but that's more of a philosophical question.
So along those lines, I think one theme that's emerging is that there's probably no real safe dose for alcohol is a health concern, and poses risks, but are there certain populations that should specifically avoid alcohol, even in moderation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question to answer. Clearly, there's folks like who have acute hepatitis, or
Mhm.
are on transplant lists for liver failure and such. Where it's a very clear what we call contraindication, right? Where you really cannot do this. It's really going to harm you. There's a lot of acute cases, and there's things like, hey, if you're a airplane pilot, you probably should be avoiding having a drink. If you're a tractor trailer driver, a heavy machine operator, et cetera, anything that impairs your judgment. But as a general rule, there's things that we call risk factors. And so risk factors alone don't mean that you are going to develop problematic drinking or have like medical sequelae or like medical problems from drinking alcohol per se, but it means that you're at a higher risk or you're predisposed for those things happening. So one of the biggest indicators is family history. And so, do you have a family history of folks, your parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, who have had troubles with consuming alcohol? Did they end up developing an alcohol use disorder, for example? That's probably one of the biggest indicators.
Okay. So for the folks listening at home who maybe enjoy a few glasses of wine a week, at what point does it become excessive? Should we stick to that seven in a week, no more than 3 in one sitting? Is that a fairly reasonable rule of thumb?
Well, so maybe, right? So there's all these caveats, and so some of my colleagues do not like the field of addiction medicine because behavioral health in general is a lot of gray space. There's not a lot of like, well, this is the rule, this is the way. And then addiction kind of takes that a step further, addiction medicine, where there's a lot of gray space. So there's not a lot of like absolute rules, so to say. So what I can say is what I shared with you earlier, that it is considered high risk or higher risk drinking. But as I also shared earlier, someone can develop problematic drinking and have medical consequences, for example, or consequences with relationships or with their performance at work or other things that are important, even if they're consuming alcohol below those limits.
Okay.
So that doesn't mean that like, oh, but I never drank more than 3 drinks at one sitting. Okay, but all these other things are happening. So it's clearly not, it's not a healthy thing for you. And it looks like it might be problematic. And some of the challenges are recognizing that when that's occurring for you, when it's kind of transitioning from something that you enjoyed socially and perhaps was even productive, like if it was part of your work where you had to kind of socialize with colleagues or business or sales, creating leads for marketing or whatever. But then it can transition, and it can transition at any time in your life. And we tend to think a lot about heavy drinking in college, for example, especially binge drinking episodes. And we actually see different kind of what we call bimodal incidence or prevalence of alcohol use disorder when we actually see a spike in retirement. When folks lose that structure of work and they lose sometimes that purpose, if their kind of role or their profession was connected to their identity, and they say, what am I going to do now? And then they start drinking a little bit more, and it's a coping skill for them. And we see many more folks have problematic drinking at that stage of their life.
That's so interesting. So what would be some signs that transition is happening, that drinking is becoming excessive and problematic?
Yeah. Again, a little bit of a gray space here. I'm gonna give you the textbook answers though. Okay. So what we're starting to get into at that point, again, if you're over those thresholds, whether or not it's harmful for you by your perception, it's technically higher risk drinking, right? So you may want to just kind of ask yourself some questions about what this looks like, whether or not you want to cut back. Things are problematic for you. When's the last time you had lab work? A lot of folks don't know that they're actually damaging their liver. And so even, having a binge episode over a weekend, many folks would be surprised to see that if you check their liver enzymes or like how efficiently their liver's working, you've actually affected and impacted your liver function just from that binge episode. Most of us who would do that as humans would rebound. The liver is an incredible organ and it can regenerate, but continued patterns, we start to see fatty liver disease and progressing into cirrhosis. So those would be some signs, of objectively, hey, folks are telling you they're worried about you. They're expressing that they're concerned about your consumption of alcohol. You got screening lab work and your liver enzymes were elevated. Could or could not be related to alcohol. There's a lot of other things that can do that too. But then there's the textbook answers I promised I'd get to. And there's really two big organizations in this field. There's the American Society of Addiction Medicine that has a definition of addiction that is really nice. And I won't bore you with it right now because I could talk about it for about a half an hour. And then more concretely, there's the DSM-5, and that was a revision of DSM-5 too, and that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And that is the book and the guidelines that are used to diagnose behavioral health disorders. So with alcohol use disorder being one of them, and in that book, there is clear elements or kind of things you can check off that lead towards a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. I won't read them all to you. I just pulled them up here quickly. Some of them are like cravings. Are you having cravings to consume more alcohol? Are you not being able to manage your responsibilities with work at home or school? Do you want to stop, but you're finding it hard to cut back or to stop? Do you constantly find that you're needing to drink more and more and more to try to get the same effect? Are you giving up things that are important to you? Are you noticing that you find yourself in harmful or risky situations, but you continue to use the substance? Are you noticing that you have symptoms of withdrawal when you stop drinking? Do you feel like you need to have a drink in the morning or to help your hands be more steady, for example? Do you feel sweaty the next day? Do you feel like your heart is racing? Is your blood pressure elevated? These are all signs that your consumption of alcohol may have crossed that threshold.
Okay. So if someone at home is thinking, oh, I can check the box on some of the things that you mentioned, what would be some first steps that she should take?
Yeah, great question. So, first of all is applauding, essentially giving yourself some credit for having the courage to ask yourself that question, because there's a lot of folks who either don't have the insight, meaning they don't recognize how their drinking is problematic for them, or they're in denial, frankly. A lot of folks can be about the fact that it is problematic for various reasons we could explore if folks are interested. And what happens too, the human mind is an extraordinary thing. We often underplay how much of a problem this is. So we call that minimization. And then it's like, oh, yeah, I just had a few drinks. It wasn't a big deal. But then if you challenge yourself to like, hey, let's look at this objectively, a few drinks, and you plot it out and you're like, oh, I had 7 last night. That's more than I thought. I didn't realize that, all these things happened in between, and that person handed me a drink and this one and X, Y, and Z. So, first thing is kind of getting real with yourself. And if you're concerned, you can also ask folks around you, that you trust. Hey, what do you think? Is this becoming a problem for me? Ask your partners, your spouses, for example. If you're interested in treatment, which if you feel that your use of alcohol is problematic, I would highly recommend. There's a couple of things to know about alcohol. One is that it's one of the only substances that we know of that when you consume too much of it, the withdrawal phenomenon can actually be fatal, meaning it can kill you. And so you may have heard of this before, that folks can have seizures if they were drinking all the alcohol and they were drinking it regularly. There's also another phenomenon called delirium tremens. And I'll share some warning signs for you just to know as well about that. And delirium tremens, when it's not treated, has a 50% fatality rate. So it is serious. It does require medical assessment and medical treatment. And so I want to get that point across very clearly. This is not something you want to try to do on your own. If you were someone who is drinking heavily and drinking regularly, do not try to quit turkey on your, or cold turkey, as they say, by just stopping consuming alcohol and saying, I'm going to fight through this, because you might not make it. And it can be extremely uncomfortable, even if you don't have those other complications, and it can be way more comfortable with medical treatment. So the fastest ways to access treatment, I'll just share with you. We have a resource at WellSpan called the Warm Line, WARM, Warm Line. And you can call that number 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can call them and remain anonymous. It's a confidential call. If you just want to talk, if you want to ask questions, and more so if you want to get connected to treatment, they can help navigate the addiction treatment space for you and with you, which can be challenging. I'll come out and say it. It's one of the reasons we created this resource. And the number for that, and hopefully we can distribute this later, is simply 1-844 Warm Line, WARMLINE. There's another resource. I'm going to pull up their number here because let you know about just like a national helpline as well. This is from SAMHSA. So this is the federal organization. SAMHSA stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And they have a line that's free as well, confidential, 24/7. And it is 1-800-662-HELP. So 1-800-662-HELP. And so same thing with them. You can call them, you can talk to them. They can help make connections to treatment if you wanted to talk to someone outside of the WellSpan organization as well.
Those sound like two really incredibly life-saving resources. We'll make sure that we distribute it to everyone who signed up for the webinar.
Great, thank you.
This has been so incredibly helpful and certainly eye-opening for me. If we have any audience questions, please submit them now. In the meantime, is there anything else that listeners at home would benefit from knowing, and maybe not particularly for themselves, but for a loved one, if they're them or someone that they know is struggling through it?
Yeah, great question. So that's actually how we started the Warm Line, is recognizing that we're building more and more infrastructure for the treatment of a substance use disorder, for example. But there's not much out there when your loved one is struggling, right? And if you've had that experience before, it's extremely challenging. A wide variety of emotions, the roller coaster up and downs, etc. So that's actually what one of the primary roles of the Warm Line is too, is to just provide support, even if it's you not kind of directly affected by a substance use challenge yourself. If you have a friend, loved one, colleague, anything, and you just want to call and talk about it, or maybe even get treatment for yourself to help you deal with the kind of emotions that you're experiencing, if it's indicated, they can help with that too. I always share with folks a couple really important things. One is that addiction, including alcohol use disorder is an addiction. These are medical diseases. And so historically, we haven't always felt that way or treated folks that way in our society. And there's been a lot of judgment. There's still a lot of stigma. And so I encourage you to please become part of the tide turning to understand that addiction is a medical disease. It's a chronic medical disease. And for some folks, it can be what we call relapsing and remitting, meaning they'll have periods of time in significant recovery where they're not using a substance, and then they'll return to use of that substance, and they'll go in waves like that. And unfortunately, we know that as part of the disease pattern. And we have really good, compelling evidence, including brain scans and a lot of really important neurobiological studies that have looked at what's happening inside the brain, the organ itself, when someone is addicted to a substance or has an addiction. Because we also know this to be true about many behavioral addictions, like gambling disorder, for example, that the brain has changed. Okay, so the things that stimulate that brain are changed. The way that brain functions changes. The ability for that brain to have impulse control, to kind of recognize that there's going to be consequences of actions and to understand what those consequences will be in the future has essentially been turned off. So the brain has said to the front part of the brain that does a lot of what we call executive function and planning. It's like, hey, we're not listening to you right now. The brake is turned off. And so a lot of the behaviors that you see in folks, and we'll say, wow, they've really changed so much. Well, this is the sequelae or the consequences of this disease that they're struggling with. And what I really, really want to get across, and I try to be an advocate of this everywhere I go, is that we have treatment for this medical disease and the treatment works. And so it's really phenomenal. When you compare treatment for, say, let's just use alcohol use disorder because we're talking about it. When you compare treatment of alcohol use disorder to other chronic medical diseases, such as COPD or type 2 diabetes, you actually see non-statistically different. So they're essentially the same from a statistical perspective, adherence to treatment and outcomes. So that means that when you think about someone who's going to see their primary care doctor for treatment of high blood pressure and someone who's going to see a doctor for treatment of alcohol use disorder, they are both just as likely to miss the next appointment or not take their medications or continue to eat salty ham and not exercise or continue to drink alcohol and have sequelae of that disease. What's been different is our response as a society and frankly in medicine. The first person who was struggling with high blood pressure would get a response of, oh, Jane or John Doe, we really got to work on this. It seems like you're having trouble. Let's think about how we can wrap more support around you. Maybe you need a nurse visit. Should we call you? Should we set a reminder on your phone so you can remember to take your medication? We've really accepted that chronic disease model of like, wow, they're struggling. Let's wrap support around them. Historically, with addiction and substance use disorders, we've said, wow, you must not be ready. You must not be really wanting this treatment. You're not committed enough. Call me back when you really want help. And so what we really have to do is change that paradigm and allow us to connect with folks in a similar way. Say, wow, thanks so much for coming. Imagine it was hard for you to tell me that you're still drinking alcohol and that it's still a problem for you. See the difference in that approach and say, I'd really like if we could think of ways that we can think about how you can become more comfortable taking the medication. You can remember to take the medication. Have you been going to groups? How's therapy going? Is that a good connection? Should we try to find a new therapist? I could go on and on, but I think I made my point here that we have treatment for this disease and the treatment works. And so encourage folks, embrace with them and try to have compassion and curiosity when you understand that someone's suffering that you may care about.
I really appreciate those two important points that you made, which is one, let's together break down the stigma, because that's, I would imagine, a huge barrier to folks getting the help that they need. And second, that the loved ones of patients with an addiction problem are very likely suffering just as much. So they can access and the resources and use those resources that are available.
Absolutely.
There was an audience question, which I love, and I promise I didn't ask this. How does caffeine addiction compare to alcohol addiction? As I have my are there similar body changes if one's trying to stop?
Yeah, it's a great question because one of the other things I talk a lot about just addiction in general, but one of the other topics that comes up a lot is marijuana. And so, one of the things I do when I'm giving a talk about that is I'll put up a slide that talks about prevalence of marijuana use disorder. And like, I'll hear some gasps in the room. And I'll be like, what was that about? Was anyone not aware that there's a such thing as marijuana use disorder? Because in our culture, we've so normalized the use of marijuana, and it's kind of has this perception of, well, then it must be safe, right? And there must be no negative consequence of this. It must not be addictive, And so they're like so surprised to see like, hey, no, we study this. It's a real problem. We have treatment, et cetera. And so I think it's similar to caffeine, where, anything that can have an effect in that way on your brain and your functioning can certainly be misused. And I use that language intentionally. So misuse meaning like using in ways that can be harmful or in ways that are not prescribed. So there's a lot of medications that fall into that category. And they're not necessarily the ones you may be thinking of. Of course, we think of like opioids, like OxyContin and fentanyl and such. And then maybe we'll start thinking of, oh, I've heard benzodiazepines can be problematic, like Ativan and Valium and Xanax. And this is true. These all can be. But then there's things like gabapentin, if you've heard of that, and Flexeril and Lyrica, stimulants like Ritalin and Adderall. These all change the way that your body perceives and in some ways, your consciousness. And anything that can have the effect on the human mind and the brain itself has a potential for misuse. And so in some interesting studies, they've actually scanned the brains of folks who were struggling with essentially eating disorders like binge eating disorder, and looked at what happened in their brain when they were saying like, I can't stop eating, I love these sugary foods, etc. And the sugar triggered similar reactions and looked the same, lighting up the brain regions when we scan their brains as folks who were misusing cocaine.
Wow.
You say, whoa, it's sugar. What's the big deal? What do you mean? Like, I have it sitting on my counter right now. But it's the idea that the human mind and brain is primed for addiction. And I can talk a little bit more about that if folks are interested. But we are all susceptible to addiction. As I was talking about earlier, we have different levels of predisposition, genetic, environmental, family history, et cetera. But every single one of us is susceptible. And the kind of similarities of caffeine, there are some folks who they love the way the caffeine makes them feel, and they drink a pot of coffee and it's not enough. So then they switch over to the energy drinks and it's not enough. And then they get, all these shots of espresso and they just keep going and going. And then they get caffeine concentrate. And we think, oh, well, you can buy it at the grocery store. What's the big deal? Well, caffeine intoxication can be fatal. You can change the way your heart beats, and you can have what's called an arrhythmia, and you can actually die from this. And so it's serious. I wouldn't say, if you find that you're drinking 2 cups of coffee compared to 1 is not necessarily the same thing as saying I'm using fentanyl right now. Like, there's a different severity level when comparing the risk of that activity, but there is not, it's not a harmless thing. When it starts escalating, when I was showing you that kind of progression where you're using more and more and more, remember that's sort of some of the stuff I was sharing with you earlier. You're having those cravings, you're increasing the level that you're using, trying to get the same effect. There's never enough type of thing. What's a little bit different is that they are fundamentally different substances. And so the different substances have different actions in our brains. So alcohol has a lot of different kind of receptors that it hits in our brain. We're quite familiar with the way that it acts as a central nervous system depressant, right? We all heard the stories of folks who have consumed too much alcohol and quote unquote pass out. We know that folks can die from intoxication from having a blood level that is too high of alcohol. There's fatal blood levels. This is largely mediated through what's called the GABA receptors, so the GABA A receptor, and it attaches onto a different subunit of that, and it lets ions flow in and out of the brain in certain ways, and I could bore you for an hour about it. But there's also activity on what's called the NMDA receptor and also the mu opioid receptor. So many folks don't know about that there is activity on those receptors. That's ketamine is a substance that has a similar effect on the NMDA receptors. And you may have heard of that being misused. And of course, opioids that we know about, like fentanyl and oxycodone, for example, have activity on the opioid receptor. So there's some commonalities. There's less activity on those receptors, but stimulants work in a different way. They're almost the opposite. And so it's kind of a common pathway for a lot of substances that create a euphoric or good experience. But I'm getting an internet connection unstable. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
No.
Yep. You're back.
You can hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Sorry. I think that was the universe's way of telling me to wrap this up.
Or the internet had too much to drink.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. So, that's just a really complicated way of saying they act on different receptors. Caffeine is what we would call a quote unquote upper. It kind of wakes you up, it activates you, it pours into different brain regions than alcohol, which is more viewed as a depressant. And so when you think about stopping these substances, it's usually the opposite of whatever the effect was for you. So when you stop drinking alcohol, that's why we see folks who have seizures and they can't sleep and they feel very anxious and they're sweaty and their heart's racing, because their body had adapted to the changes of taking a depressant for so long. And so the opposite of the stimulant is that you take the stimulant away, now you don't have all that stimulation, you kind of get really depressed. Folks who stop
Oh, you're back.
Oh my goodness. I'm gonna try to hop onto a different network as we're chatting here. I apologize for this. I have full bars to my router, but somehow it's glitching.
I know it is so frustrating.
Yeah.
But that was really helpful that in coming off of something like alcohol, you'll potentially experience the opposite effects as what that substance causes.
Yeah.
If I could be so greedy to ask one more audience question.
Of course.
The question is, even beyond some of the known negative physical and neurologic effects from alcohol, like passing out and other physical signs of being sick, within more moderate uses, are there effects on the body and our brain, even with smaller amounts?
Yeah. So great question. So there's a couple of things to know here. So one is it's on the question. So thanks for asking it. Someone who is quote unquote in the safe. So I got to just nix that. I don't know what's safe. That's for you to determine. But what's different is how our bodies react based on our tolerance to the substance. So for the purpose of this discussion, we'll say someone who occasionally has a beer or a glass of wine with dinner, okay? Or maybe they have, every once in a while they have two, okay? And they're not kind of crossing over that threshold where they're having more than 7 in a week. They're not crossing the threshold of having more than 3 at one sitting. They're very unlikely to have developed any sort of physiological tolerance compared to someone who has been drinking, 12 drinks per night, for example. I would absolutely expect that their body has become tolerant. And so why that's important is because the way that our bodies react is based on essentially what that dose means to us.
Mhm.
So if you've ever been on a medication where you needed to increase the dose to get to a quote unquote therapeutic level, it's kind of the same concept. Like the dose of just skipping right ahead, say you needed to get to 100 milligrams, but you could only increase by 25. Well, you needed to allow your body to become tolerant to it, because if you just skipped right ahead to 100, it would have been way too much. You would have had bad effects from that. So it's kind of similar. So the reason I'm making that distinction is because the person who just very occasionally has a glass of wine compared to the person who drinks 12 drinks every night and has a glass of wine, the effect on the body is going to be a little different. Okay. It's going to be the same pathways, but the magnitudes are going to be different. And from a really kind of nuanced kind of analysis of what happens at receptors in the brain, it's going to be just a little different, but it's an important difference. So alcohol is an inhibitor, as I was talking about earlier, right? It's a central nervous system depressant, but the biggest activity it has on the brain is on those GABA receptors. And GABA receptors usually, they're kind of like the brakes on things. They're like, whoa, you got to stop. They're just walking around telling everyone they need to stop. And so alcohol inhibits the inhibitors first. Okay. So it inhibits everything, but the first neurons or little parts of your brain that it says, you got to stop now, are the ones that are trying to tell everything else to stop. So it's kind of a double negative. So what happens is you actually get a little activated. So you may have been kind of picking up on that. You're like, well, wait a second, Dr. Crawford, you're telling me that this is a central nervous system depressant, but every single time I have a drink or two with my friends, we're giggling all the time. We're telling all these stories we would never tell, if we weren't consuming a glass of wine. And, the next day I'm like, oh, I can't believe I said that kind of thing. That doesn't sound like a depressant. That is why, okay? It is a depressant. It just depressed your inhibitors first. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. And then as you continue to consume more alcohol, then it starts inhibiting everything else. So that's why the end result of continued consumption is coma. Essentially you've shut down the brain, you've shut down the respiratory drive, everything has been turned off. Wow. So if you are a very occasional drinker, you have no tolerance, that first, you may see kind of that whole spectrum in not the entire spectrum. I take that back.
Hopefully
the spectrum not. Of going from that like disinhibition to feeling kind of woozy, right? Or a little bit intoxicated, right? You're noticing your balance is off, and all these things just from like 2 drinks, right? Compared to the person who drinks 12 drinks every night, they're probably not starting to really feel intoxicated yet. So that's why there's that difference of why I was describing that to you. And the reason that's important is because as you become, more affected, we'll say, by the alcohol, whatever level it is for you, you're more likely to have bad outcomes from that. So we think about that kind of period of being that disinhibition period, we call it, where it's like, oh, I'm having so much fun. I'm giggling. I got my rose-colored glasses on. The world's a great place. Everyone's giving hugs. When that crosses over into, and I'm starting to feel a little intoxicated, wobbly, wasn't that funny? I knocked over my water kind of stuff. That is when you're more likely to, fall, when you're more likely to cut yourself, when you're more likely to get into a motor vehicle accident, when you're more likely, like the list goes on and on and on.
Sure.
So that's why it's important to know the difference.
That's incredible. I found that really helpful. And I'm sure listeners at home did too, because I think that we attribute a lot of positive effects from some of those initial disinhibition, like relaxing, maybe perceiving that we have improved relation and communication with friends, but being aware that that's the first sign that probably more negative things are right around the corner is important.
Yeah, it certainly can be. Yeah, and I don't mean to, tell everyone the sky is falling. Like I said,
No,
there's some folks who really enjoy alcohol. It's an important part of their life. They drink it responsibly. They haven't had any negative health consequences. They understand that it's not a health food, but they accept the fact. It's like eating chocolate cake, right? Like, what's the health benefit of chocolate cake, right?
right.
We still buy chocolate cake. We make chocolate cake. We sing birthdays with, I'm not saying that they're the same. You're probably not going to end up in the hospital from eating too much chocolate cake at one time,
Well,
but
maybe eventually.
eventually you could, sure. But there are folks who like it's a quote unquote positive thing in their life. It's something they do socially with friends and they like it and it never becomes problematic. But technically, there are many folks who start that way and then it progresses into something that is problematic.
Right. Well, this has been so wonderful. I can't thank you enough for talking about such an incredibly helpful and potentially life-saving topic. And I am sure that you touched listeners at home who may have been thinking about some of their own habits and or those of a loved one. So we will make sure that we get the contact info to the two resources you shared with us. Any last words?
Yeah. Of course. As you can tell by now, I'm not shy of talking. You may be hoping that the internet cuts me out again here. I don't know.
Never.
But I do just want to share with you guys, as I'm not trying to be like an over alarmist and say the sky is falling. It is important to recognize, as I said earlier, that there is significant risk. There's no health benefit, no matter what the amount is. So just please take that in mind. Remember what I said earlier. Please come from a place of curiosity and compassion and love and recognition that this is a medical disease. When folks are really struggling, help connect them to treatment because treatment works. We have treatment that's very effective. And the last thing I'll say is just an acknowledgement of this, the target audience here that we're talking with. Unfortunately, when we look at studies over the past decade or two, we've seen a really dramatic increase in problematic and high-risk drinking in women and in folks who are older aged. And so I really want you to think about that, what that might mean for you. We think, in the past, there's really been this great divide between problematic drinking, between, in a binary gender construct, men and women. And looking at that same kind of binary construct, that divide has been closing. And so what that means is there's more and more women accelerating the rate of which their drinking is becoming high risk and problematic.
Thank you for sharing that.
Of course. It's been such a pleasure to be here and chat with folks. The questions are great.
Okay, well, I'll let Sue wrap it up. And thank you everyone for joining us.
I want to thank you both so much. Dr. Crawford, I have to tell you, I love your approach in how you provide education and that you offer encouragement regarding addictive behavior, both for those who are suffering with it themselves and those who have loved ones who may have some problems. You've really made me think. I have a new perspective in regard to some of my previous attitudes. Not that I was closed-minded, but one of the most important things that hit home for me was how addictive behavior, regardless of what your addiction is with, will change your brain chemistry. That's any addictive behavior, whether it's a substance abuse or just behavior, will that change your brain activity? Like, okay, I have one that's kind of off the wall, but someone who has a problem with hoarding, or someone who has a problem with constantly needing to shop, to purchase things, to give gifts, does that change brain chemistry as well?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Sue. I appreciate your kind comments, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you guys. Um, it's a little complicated. Some of it is chicken and eggish, but really the way we think about it is that, and I could bore you for like an hour talking about neurobiology of addiction here, but it's really that you're introducing stimulation to regions of your brain in ways that were never physiologically supposed to be stimulated so intensely. So, in some ways it's like, I tell folks a really quick analogy with this is like, I like chocolate cake. Obviously, I brought chocolate cake up earlier. Dr. Ochalski is telling me I'm going to end up in the hospital because I'm eating too much chocolate cake. I'm worried now. But I don't walk into a room and cut a slice of chocolate cake and then say I'm going to eat the rest of it and smash my face into it. And like everyone in the room is like, what's this guy doing? Right? I may want to. I may take that first bite and my brain says, wow, best chocolate cake I ever had. Steal that thing, run back to your office and lock the door. But remember, I said earlier, the fun part of my brain is like, come on, Mitch, that's not you. You don't do that. Look at all these other people you want to share the cake with. You're going to get a bellyache. Dr. Ochalski's right. You're going to end up in the hospital because you're eating too much chocolate cake. And the difference is like, that's a physiological normal stimulation, right? Like food is normal. What happens when things kind of cross over into unnormal, like for example, you stick a probe in my head and you measure in a certain region, what's the response, and we'll just make up fake units to food. While chocolate cake is 10, I take cocaine, maybe it's 100, right? I take methamphetamine, maybe it's 500 or 1,000. So you see these like orders of magnitude of difference of stimulation of these brain pathways, and the brain goes, whoa, like I've never seen anything like this, and it shouldn't have ever seen anything like that. It wasn't developed to handle that kind of stimulation. And what happens is the brain says, I want that again, and it reinforces the way to try to find it again. It starts remembering what it felt like. It associates memories and feelings. It starts planning ways to get it again. It starts shutting off the parts of your brain that say this is going to be a problem for you or you need to stop. And then before you know it, you've reinforced pathways that just get you more and more, and turned off pathways that kind of push you in the other direction of saying this is harmful or you got to stop. And so that's really what happens. And then the result of that is the behavior you were alluding to, Sue. So this is some of the stuff that, outwardly, this is what we're perceiving, right? That is, what we see is kind of like, wow, they're really going through a tough time right now, the way that their behavior is. It is a little bit different. I just want to draw a slight caveat here. It's a little bit different. Technically, hoarding disorder is a separate disorder. It's not technically considered part of the addictive disorders that you were talking about earlier. There are certainly some similarities. And I forget, shopping, I mean, it's an area of interest right now. There's a couple of those like internet gaming disorder, for example, where like clearly there's something happening there, but it's not absolutely recognized as an addiction in some circles. But there are things like gambling disorder and gaming disorder, for example, that are really recognized as far as behavioral addictions.
Dr. Ochalski, Dr. Crawford, thank you again. This has been amazing. Everybody have a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.